Welcome to The Call, an exclusive conversation hosted by the Chamber's Global Intelligence Desk. We're delighted you are able to join us. Please note the views of our guests today are not necessarily those of the Chamber, but we hope you will find those views as valuable as we do. Please feel free to put questions into the Q&A at any time, and we'll address as many as we can after the interview. Let's get started. Good morning, and welcome to The Call, brought to you by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce here in Washington. I'm your host, Jay Sapsford, and here's the question of the moment. How united is the European Union in 2025? Europe is being tested like never before. Over the past 25 years, the continent has relied on trade, cheap energy, and transatlantic security to fuel its growth. But as European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen warned last week, those days are over. Europe's economy is struggling, and the alliance with the U.S. will be front and center now that both Brussels and Washington are welcoming new administrations. Meanwhile, Europe now faces an era of intense global competition amid mounting internal challenges, including energy insecurity, the rise of populism, burdensome regulations, pressure to raise defense spending, and the ongoing war in Ukraine. These challenges raise pressing questions about Europe's unity and its role on the global stage. And to help us explore these critical developments, we are honored to welcome Dr. Alexandra de Hoop Scheffer, Acting President of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Alexandra, welcome to The Call, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Jay. It's a pleasure to be with you.
President Trump is a familiar person to many in our audience and certainly around the world. But what I think most people don't understand is the changes that have gone on in Europe since he was last in office. I wonder if you could walk us through some of those changes and why they're important.
Absolutely. I think the Europe that Trump is facing in 2025 is significantly different from the Europe he was facing in 2016. Basically for three reasons. One, obviously, the geopolitical environment has dramatically changed since 2016. Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022 has fundamentally altered European security perceptions and priorities, and has led to increase in defense spending and a renewed focus on NATO's importance. And yet, when you look at the figures, in 2024, the 27 EU countries collectively spent an average of 1.9% of GDP on defense. So there's much more to do. The second significant change has been obviously the economic headwinds that Europe had to cope with, including COVID-19, an energy crisis stemming from reduced Russian gas supplies. And so this has, in fact, accelerated what you're seeing today at the EU level is a collective reflection on EU's hyper-dependencies in critical sectors where it needs to invest massively. That's energy, that's critical supply chains, and of course, it's defense. And then finally, but not least, domestic politics. Europe looks very different from what it looked back in 2016. Why? Because of the rise of the far right across all EU member states. And that is also fueling a lot of fragmentation, instability, and more polarization across all EU member states. You just look at France and Germany, right? The two big ones. Today, the French and German are unable to actually lead the EU because of their domestic politics. And that is a big concern because we all know that when the French-German tandem is not working, then it's very difficult for the EU to move forward. And that is obviously having direct implications on EU unity, but also on EU's ability to engage in a coherent and organized way vis-a-vis the Trump administration.
Alexandra, you mentioned fragmentation. Is part of that sort of the rise of this nativist sentiment among the voters that we saw in the elections last year? And how might that affect economic policy? Do we see more protectionists, more restrictions on trade and that sort of thing?
So what's really interesting is that what you're seeing is a second Ursula von der Leyen's European Commission that is actually recalibrating the priorities of the EU for the 5 years to come because of the shifts in domestic politics across the EU member states. These past 5 years, 2019, 2024, was all about the Green Deal, was all about the response to COVID-19, right? These were the two top priority at the EU level. 2025, 2030 is going to be very different. Number one is competitiveness, and that's really the industrial policy, the massive investments that the EU needs to make in some critical areas if it doesn't want to disappear from the global scene. The second top priority is defense and security. And the third one is immigration. And so what you're seeing is, yes, there is a sense that there is a need to invest in Europe as Europeans in order to remain competitive and not become a spectator, if I can say, or squeezed between the two big ones, the United States and China, you know, and you've mentioned EU's fragmentation. Again and again, it's EU's fragmentation that is a burden on EU's capacity to lead and to lead in three critical domains: tech innovation, the green transition, and geopolitics, defense, and security. And when you take these three critical domains, which, by the way, are fully intersecting and interlinked, these are the three domains where Europeans are the most dependent, either and or vis-a-vis the United States and China. And so now today, the priority if for Europeans, and we've seen it, you know, in the release of this competitiveness compass that the European Commission just presented, this is really going to steer the EU's priority for the 5 years to come, and I would even say beyond.
So that report that was just released, it talked a lot about the need to deregulate and to lift the burden of regulation off of the business sector so they can feel free to grow and try to regain some of the vitality that many have said Europe has lost in recent years. How do you do that, though, and while still maintaining some of the social contract that it has with its voters, whether it's the welfare state or for some of the other issues which voters have come to expect from their governments, which is, you know, a little bit more generous than what we're used to here in the United States?
Absolutely. I think there is an understanding today that an entity like the EU cannot win in the global competition by regulating, right? Normative power doesn't make you win, right? It can help you shape policies at the European level, at the global level. And we've seen it, you know, on data privacy and data protection that the EU has led in many ways. On the sustainability, the climate, the EU has led in many ways the agenda on these two key issues. But there is a sense and a very tangible awareness today in Brussels and across EU capitals that this went too far. There has been too much regulations. And so now it's a time where the EU is reassessing, right? And recalibrating and shifting the overall mindset. Let's stop over-regulating and let's shift the mindset to let's start investing and investing seriously in these three critical domains: tech, green, and defense. And I would say that this is, of course, important first and foremost for Europeans, but it's also critical in order to find a way of rebalancing the transatlantic relationship and for Europeans to be more credible partners for Washington in the forthcoming years.
It's often said that the artificial intelligence boom is 80% positive and 20% scary. And it seems like it's further said that the United States is focused on that 80%, whereas Europe is focused on the 20% that could be sort of disruptive or worse. I wonder, how do you write something like that, and particularly in the tech sector that you mentioned? You mentioned the need for innovation. I just wonder what Europe needs to do in order to do that. Is it just a matter of lifting of regulation, or do you have to be a little bit more targeted in how you approach that?
I think it's really about the regulation on corporate governance, right? And what you're seeing today, it's really interesting, is to see how today it's the private sector who is making the lines move in Brussels, right? There is a fatigue, and you've seen it these past couple of days. CEOs, speaking very publicly that there is a fatigue of EU regulation, that EU over-regulation is impeding innovation. It's not a question of rewinding on European values, but it's really about, alleviating some of the bureaucratic burden and some of the reporting burden that companies have been engaged now in terms of reporting, for example, on their decarbonization strategy. So that's number one. The other thing I think that is absolutely necessary, it's not just about cutting red tape and debureaucratizing Brussels and the way the EU, does its work, policies, and legislation. I think what is profoundly missing today in Brussels is a much deeper, much more strategic reflection on the role of the EU in the world. There is a very critical need to update some of the thought processes, some of the mindsets, right, that the EU has been used to be in these past couple of 30, 40 years. Update their lenses, update their mechanism, be careful of not over-regulating. I'm going to give you a very concrete example. BioNTech, probably Europe's most spectacularly successful business upstart, decided to move its cancer vaccine research to post-Brexit UK, right? For the reasons that I've just mentioned. And so we have come in Europe to a terrible paradox where it's better to do business outside of the EU rather than inside of the EU. And so if the European Commission, von der Leyen #2, is truly serious about this so-called competitiveness compass, it will have to address the issues very quickly and very forcefully.
Now, I'm getting some questions from our audience members, one of which is, can Europe continue to effectively outsource its defense to the United States? That may be putting it quite strong, but I see the point here. I wonder if you might be able to address that. And this is an opportunity for us to get into some of the defense issues you mentioned earlier.
No, absolutely. And actually, that question and that language was recently used post-Trump election, early November, not by the French president, Emmanuel Macron, who likes talking of European strategic autonomy, but that was actually a formula that was presented by the Polish Prime Minister, Donald Tusk. So it's also very interesting. And I've been traveling across at least 10 EU member states these past couple of months to see that this awareness that, as you just said, that the EU cannot continue to outsource its collective security and defense to others, and mainly the United States, is something that now is shared across EU member states. Then the divergence is, how do you do this, right? And where do you find the money to, again, forcefully, seriously invest in European defense capabilities? Why is this question so important? Think of a scenario, and we should think of all scenarios today, considering all the crises both the US and Europe needs to face together, where you have another crisis in EU's neighborhoods, right? And Washington will say, this is not an American vital interest. This is something that Europeans need to take care of because it's European business. Then the response will be European. And in order to respond, Europeans will need to have these capabilities. I also mentioned Ukraine. What you're seeing in Ukraine, and it has already started at the end of the Biden administration, is a very clear American position telling European allies, the United States is there, we're supporting, we're contributing to assisting and sending military assistance to Ukraine. But the United States will not be able to sustain that effort to the level as it is today. And so increasingly, we're moving away from the boring burden sharing debate to more of the burden shifting debate that I've been talking about these past 10 years. And that puts Europeans in a much more challenging position, and in a position where they simply do not have any choice but to invest in European defense capabilities. One last thing on that is that if Europeans seriously decide to beef up their European defense industry, it needs to be done in coalition with the United States, within the NATO framework, with the British. We need to rethink the way Europeans do that. And what I think is really interesting is that there's going to be a strategic retreat of the 27 EU leaders on February the 3rd. And 2 guests will be invited at that summit, which will mainly deal with European defense and security: the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, and the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte. And I think that's exactly the way these issues should be addressed.
So is there a consensus, or will this meeting be a chance to build a consensus about how Europe should go about expanding its defense industrial base and its ability to carry a greater burden, share the burden of its own defense?
Yeah, I think again, Jay, why is there no European defense industry today? Again, it's because of EU's fragmentation and disunity, to take the title of this session. The EU member states are not united, and not only are they not united on how to do it, but they are competing, with one another, right? It's national defense industries competing with other national defense industries. So I think it's about time that countries get over their national interest and think in terms of the European collective interest. And that's a leap that leaders need to do. But if that leap doesn't occur, then it's doomed. Then you're going to ask me, that's all very nice, but how do you fund this, right? And that's the, if I can say, the sticky point of that EU conversation. There are some, I would say, basically 3 pathways of collectively funding the development of European defense capabilities. Of course, jointly borrowed EU defense bonds, so that would be a sort of replica of what the EU has successfully done in order to respond to the economic shock of COVID-19. But there again, that a number of countries are against. The other one that is being highly discussed today is to let the EU's European Investment Bank fund defense projects in the EU bloc. There again, there's no consensus. And then, of course, it will fall at the end of the day to member states to simply increase their defense spending. And I would say the scope and the speed of the escalation of defense spending is very different from one capital to another. I was in Vilnius a couple of days ago, and Lithuania announced that it would be investing 5 to 6% of its GDP in defense in the 5 years to come. You look at Italy, you look at other countries, you're not in the same speed nor scope and figures. So that would be my, if I can say, my plea is to say, let's get together. I hope that this February 3rd meeting will really be framed within that mindset. How do we collectively, as Europeans, get our act together and identify, let's say the three key areas where the EU need to seriously invest in order to be less dependent on others. And it's not just on the United States. As you may know, Poland is massively buying South Korean, right? We are buying Turkish drones. So all of that is part of a broader European reflection. Where are the areas where the EU is too dependent on others? And therefore, where does the EU need to seriously invest, again, to avoid being squeezed in the middle of this broader power competition?
Okay, I've got a question here I want to squeeze in here. It's a great one because it looks forward beyond the year ahead. What is the outlook for the EU for 2030 as a result of the ongoing political challenges in the EU with shifts in government leadership?
Yeah. I would frame it in a transatlantic context, because I think the destinies of the United States and Europe are interlinked. And at a time where you have both a new American administration and a new European Commission, I think this is a moment where we need to collectively think together and transatlantically. The US and Europe continue to have the largest, most integrated bilateral trade and investment relationship in the world. The US businesses invest 4 times as much in the EU as they do in the Asia Pacific region. And European companies invest over 10 times more in the US than in India and China combined. So that's the big picture. And that is something that we need to cherish, and that we need to capitalize in order not to build separate agendas on climate, on tech, on defense, but we need to think of how do we rebalance that relationship in order for us together, again, to be able to address some of the most critical global challenges in front of us, but also within a broader context of shifting alliances and other alliances that are seeking to redefine the rules of the game, but according to a very different set of values. The last thing I would say, I think it's very important today for Europeans, Americans, again, to have a clear understanding of the intersection of the issues, of the challenges, of the geographies of the crisis. This is an era of intersections. And that's why both Europe, the United States, and other allies are struggling to find solutions or to design the right policies, because it's highly, highly complex. And I'll end up by saying, again, for me, there are 3 pillars that will make the EU a successful player in the global competition. And these are the 3 pillars where Europeans need to highly invest in. It's tech innovation, it's, of course, the green transition, and it's, of course, security. And what I would love to do as a person who, embodies the transatlantic relationship for these past 20 years is that we find a way with the Trump administration to co-author this agenda, to set the agenda together, because the US and Europe are stronger together. So that's really the message I want to address today.
Well, our audience members are among those who are investing these massive amounts of capital in the European economy and welcoming European investment in the United States. They've had their morning shot of informational espresso, so we'll leave it there and tackle the day. Let me thank Dr. Alexandra de Hoop Scheffer, Acting President of the German Marshall Fund of the United States. Alexandra, thank you so much for swinging by this morning.
Thank you so much.
And a warm thank you to you, our members, for joining us today for this special exclusive episode of The Call. If you have a theme you would like us to cover, please feel free to reach out to us at the email on the screen, globalintel@uschamber.com. We are planning many shows in the coming weeks and months, and we welcome your suggestions and feedback. This has been The Call, brought to you by the Global Intelligence Desk of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, asking the right questions to navigate uncertain times.